Welcome to 5 Good Minutes. You're listening to today's inspirational message on the book of Mark with Mark Lunsford.
As we begin Mark chapter 15, we remember that Jesus has been arrested and tried by the chief priests and the elders. Throughout this chapter, we will see Jesus turned over to the Romans, crucified, and buried. With the benefit of history on our side, we can read this tragic chapter and realize that Jesus had to go through all of this in order to ultimately pay the price and bring salvation to you and me. I can only imagine what it was like for those followers of Christ in that day. Even if they truly believed that Jesus was the Messiah, I'm sure that the events leading to Jesus' death were difficult to understand. Let's start by reading Mark 15, verses 1 through 5. Very early in the morning, the chief priests, with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin made their plans. So they bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. "Are you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate. "You have said so," Jesus replied. The chief priest accused him of many things. So again, Pilate asked him, "Aren't you going to answer? See how many things they are accusing you of?" But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. We see that the chief priests and the elders hand Jesus over to Pilate, the Roman governor. Why do they do this? The primary reason is that they didn't have the authority to sentence him to death, and this is what the religious leaders wanted. They also wanted to be able to distance themselves so they wouldn't have the final responsibility. So Pilate asks Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" See, this is the primary charge that the chief priests and elders have brought. They needed a political reason for Pilate to be able to execute Jesus, and by saying that Jesus claimed to be the king of the Jews, they were accusing him of treason, because they knew the Romans would say there was no king but Caesar. So it's interesting to hear how Pilate handles this trial, though. Does he recognize something about Jesus that gives him pause? It seems that he is trying to get Jesus to defend himself. When Pilate asks if he's the king of the Jews, Jesus gives an ambiguous answer. "You have said so." Jesus was indeed the king of the Jews, but not in a political or military sense. He was not going to deny who he was, but he knew that it wouldn't be understood at that moment. And more importantly, that moment was leading to the ultimate sacrifice. In the next few verses, we see how Pilate tries to see if there's another way to get himself out of the situation in verses 6 through 15. Now it was the custom at the festival to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. "Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate, knowing it was out of self-interest that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. "What shall I do then with the one you call the king of the Jews?" Pilate asked them. "Crucify him," they shouted. "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him." Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. In this passage, Pilate doesn't seem convinced of Jesus' guilt. So he offers Barabbas, someone who has committed murder, in exchange for Jesus. But the chief priests and elders are able to stir up the crowd. They would have had a lot of influence with the Jewish people, and so the cries, "Crucify him," grow louder and louder. Pilate doesn't want to riot, so he decides to give them what they want. Now, the plan is set in motion. As I look at this part of the story, one thing that amazes me is that the accusers of Jesus were the religious leaders. These were some of the most educated followers of the law, but they were blinded. They couldn't see that the Messiah was right in front of them. They had an expectation of how the Messiah was going to come, and Jesus did not meet their expectations. You know, if we're not careful, we can be guilty of missing Jesus in our lives in much the same way. Are there times when we make choices that completely exclude how Jesus would want us to respond? Have we trusted in our own ways instead of God's because we didn't truly trust His plan? God, help us not to be blinded by our own expectations, but to fully put our trust in You every day. God, thank You for the opportunity we have to pray and to know that You hear us. Lead us today and open our eyes to Your plan for our lives. Amen.
Thanks for joining us here today. There's a lot of great content to explore on Orchard Hill Plus and on the Orchard Hill main feed from the weekend. Have a great day.